What percentage of the federal budget do you think goes to pay for foreign aid? If you're like the average American, you probably think that it's about 25%. The actual number is about 1%. I'm Ryan, and this is why Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency is a doomed to fail scam.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency is a project created seemingly in large part to satisfy a 53-year-old man's obsession with a decade-old meme involving a funny-looking dog, but it was also supposed to be about government efficiency. Originally, DOGE wanted to make government more efficient by cutting $2 trillion from the $6.8 trillion federal budget.
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
Well, I think we could do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
This would be a huge cut if it happened, but Elon Musk is no stranger to over-promising. That $2 trillion goal was ridiculous, and it was very quickly scaled back to $1 trillion, and then scaled back again to $150 billion. A promise that started as a nearly 30% cut to the federal budget has been walked back to something around 2%. And based on the fact that the Treasury Department is reporting that federal outlays are actually higher today than they were a year ago, combined with the fact that the Trump administration is advocating for a $150 billion increase in military spending, exactly equivalent to what DOGE is now promising to cut, I wouldn't bet on that 2% savings being very realistic either. The truth of the matter is that DOGE as a budget-cutting project was always doomed to fail. It's incredibly unlikely that they will actually reduce overall spending. We can tell just by taking a quick look at what the federal budget actually is spent on and what the Trump administration is promising to do. Like I said earlier, the federal government spent $6.8 trillion last year. Let's see where that all went. This will be a brief discussion of government finance, which might sound very boring and complicated, but it's actually so easy that I can explain it while playing Subway Surfers. This is a graphic from the Congressional Budget Office. This outer ring represents mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is mandated to occur each year by law and does not have to be approved every year by Congress. It's the largest category of spending the US government does. This stuff is typically harder to cut because it has to be done outside the yearly standard appropriations process. The middle ring on this chart is discretionary spending. This type of spending has to be approved every year by Congress, and so it usually comes under a lot more scrutiny. The biggest single item in this category is the military, but it also includes a whole bunch of other stuff like veterans benefits, law enforcement, transportation, disaster relief, foreign aid, national parks, education, and science. The innermost ring on the chart is the interest the government has to pay on the debt they take on in order to cover the difference between what we take in through taxes and what we spend. There. I guarantee you now know a little bit more about how the federal budget works than most Americans, and we all got our brain rot dopamine hit. But back to DOGE. The thing about the federal budget is that every one of those $6.8 trillion is important to somebody. Everything, down to absolutely minuscule grants, is fought over and negotiated between different departments, the staff of different congresspeople, and different pressure groups and their constituencies. I would know, I used to be involved in this stuff professionally. So if you were Elon Musk and you've decided that you want to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget, where would you start? Well, the biggest category here is Social Security. You can't touch that. That's retirement money, and older people are reliable Republican voters, so you can't afford to alienate them. Well, moving on. Let's try Medicare. Healthcare for older people, same problem. Scratch that, moving on. Medicaid, healthcare for poor adults and children, about 1 in 5 Americans. Well, kids don't vote, and the GOP isn't super interested in helping the poor, frankly, so maybe put a pin in that. But Republicans have a narrow majority in Congress and are pretty afraid of political blowback, since Democrats are always saying that the GOP wants to gut Medicaid. You know, let's just rule out mandatory spending entirely. It requires too many vulnerable members of Congress to stick their necks out and vote to cut popular programs that help too many people. And Elon Musk can't feasibly use DOGE to shut these programs down without hurting reliable Republican voters. Let's move on to discretionary spending. Oh, now we're talking. Let's find some woke liberal nonsense to cut. What do we have here? Okay, well, obviously not the military. Trump's promised to bump that one up to $1 trillion on its own. Looking a little shaky on that $2 trillion cutting goal now, since non-defense discretionary spending is only $960 billion, but let's ignore that for now. Can't do veterans benefits either. That one's a loser, but aha. International affairs. We hate foreign aid, woke HIV/AIDS prevention. We can cut that. That's $21 billion right there. Of course, just a portion of this money has saved millions of lives over the years, but really, who cares about that? Certainly not Elon Musk. So you start to see the problem, right? The biggest chunks of the federal budget, things that make up government assistance to people and things related to the military, are basically politically impossible to touch if you want to cut spending. So very quickly, that original $2 trillion goal has to come all the way down to $150 billion, because $2 trillion is delusional, even for Elon Musk. But even getting to that $150 billion goal isn't an easy task when the only things you're actually able to touch are little tiny programs only liked by people who already hate you. This is why DOGE has made so much noise attacking easy targets like foreign aid or canceling newspaper subscriptions for government offices, because they're running out of popular targets. Lots of people, even Republicans, like the national parks and NASA and highways. Since there's nowhere near enough easy targets that DOGE can just unilaterally mess with no one stopping them to meet their goals for budget cuts, Elon Musk has resorted to just pushing for the sale of federal buildings. Of course, though, as we briefly discussed earlier, the biggest reason that Elon Musk and DOGE is doomed to fail at actually saving the government money is that Elon Musk's boss, Donald Trump, has promised to actually increase spending by more than DOGE is now promising to save. Donald Trump wants $150 billion more for the military to bring its budget up to $1 trillion. So we're already neutral in terms of what DOGE is now promising to cut versus what Trump is promising to spend. But Trump's also promised to spend massive amounts more on things like Homeland Security to carry out his mass deportation plan. But this is only looking at one side of the federal budget equation. You may have heard of something called the national debt. This is something that Republicans are allegedly very concerned about. But what is it? If you look at this graph, you will notice that the government spends more money than it takes in through taxes each year. The difference between what the government spends and what it takes in is called the deficit. In order to make up the deficit, the government has to borrow money. Add up the debt that the government has accumulated over the years, and you get the national debt. Now, there's a lot of moralizing around the national debt, and I want to briefly just say that debt can be good or bad depending on a variety of factors. We don't think of a person who gets a loan to buy a house the same way as someone who accumulates a ton of gambling debt or something. The amount of house versus gambling that's represented in the national debt is actually what a lot of budget fights are about, but that's a conversation for another time. What I tend to care about more than the national debt in itself is the amount of interest the government has to pay on the debt that we owe each year. The more the national debt grows, the larger the interest payments we have to get. Like I said before, debt isn't inherently evil or something, but these interest payments do become a bigger burden the larger they get as a percentage of the total federal budget. So I guess to summarize, we shouldn't be making that number go up for no reason, which is why it's incredibly stupid that DOGE wants to do things to save money, like slashing enforcement for tax cheating and evasion, which will reduce the amount of revenue the government takes in over the next decade by hundreds of billions of dollars if those cuts stay in place. This is in addition to the fact that Trump wants to extend the tax cuts from his first term and has promised tax exemptions for all sorts of other new things, which will increase the deficit. Occasionally, you hear that tax cuts pay for themselves with increased growth, because if your economy gets larger, you can collect more money without raising the actual rates. 15% of $200,000 is more than 20% of $100,000. You get the idea. The problem is that while cutting taxes does theoretically increase growth some because people have more money to spend, the idea that this growth totally offsets the lost revenue from a tax cut is ridiculous. It's absurd. It comes nowhere close. The Tax Foundation, which I believe can be fairly described as center-right, found that increased growth generated by extending those tax cuts would only offset 16% of the lost revenue. So the deficit would get a lot worse. All of this, of course, is impacted by the fact that Trump is promising ridiculous tariffs, which are just about the last thing you'd want to be doing if you're counting on your tax cut magically paying for itself with increased growth, because tariffs are terrible for economic growth. Check out my video on tariffs here. But we've moved off DOGE and Elon Musk a little bit here. So let me just bring it back and say that all the cuts that DOGE is doing may not even be legal. The Constitution gives spending power to Congress, and the idea that the executive branch can just decide to unilaterally defund things that Congress has passed laws to pay for is kind of insane, actually. This will be and is being litigated in the courts, so we'll see how that goes. But it brings me back to the limitations of DOGE. As we've seen, the problem that DOGE fundamentally faces is that these little programs that they've been able to bully are basically couch change compared to where most of the money is spent in the federal government. on the military and on the big programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There's just no way around the fact that if you want to seriously cut the federal budget, some of these line items are going to have to take a hit. But it's much more difficult to go after mandatory spending than it is to just go after USAID. So difficult that DOGE can't do it. It needs Congress to do it. Remember when I mentioned Medicaid earlier? Congressional Republicans are proposing $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid over the next 10 years under the auspices of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, but also to make that tax cut I talked about earlier less catastrophic in terms of increasing the budget deficit. To the extent that there is waste, fraud, and abuse in government, of course, I would like to see that rooted out. I'm against corruption, and I don't think anyone wants their government wasting their money. But when you hear people talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, take a look at what the solutions they're actually proposing are. The methods Congress wants to utilize here with Medicaid basically just amount to putting more roadblocks in the way of people getting Medicaid. This is not reducing waste, fraud, and abuse. It's just reducing the scope of Medicaid. It's kicking people off of their health insurance to save money. If that's what you want to do, at least be honest about it. The legislative process is still working itself out, and this is very controversial even among Republicans. Trump has in the past promised to veto Medicaid cuts. I guess we'll see. I don't know if I'd trust his word. I'd also potentially be more sympathetic to arguments about waste, fraud, and abuse if the people who say they're concerned with waste, fraud, and abuse weren't the exact same people cheering on allowing more people to get away with cheating on their taxes, as we discussed earlier. So if DOGE was doomed to fail from the start, if really the only way to actually achieve the kinds of serious cuts to federal spending that they say they want to do is to involve Congress to go after social programs or the military, if they've had to cut their $2 trillion goal down to $150 billion and may not even reach that, if they're resorting to selling off government buildings like a chop shop, stripping a car for parts, if budget cuts and especially deficit reduction are fundamentally at odds with what Donald Trump is promising people, then what's the point of DOGE at all? Aside from just being a patronage position for Elon Musk since he was instrumental to Trump's victory in 2024, I think we should consider that DOGE is not in practice a budget cutting program. It's just one half of a budget shifting program that is the Trump administration. It functions like a propaganda tool. DOGE exists to eliminate things that the MAGA coalition doesn't like, things like foreign aid or humanities funding, absolutely minuscule portions of the federal budget. In a very loud and bombastic way, it's fodder for the conservative media ecosystem. This gives the Trump administration the narrative cover they need to spend more money on the things that they do like, mass deportations and bombs, while allowing Republicans generally to paint all cuts, even to programs like Medicaid, as cutting waste. A well-functioning, efficient government without corruption is a fantastic goal, but this is not what the administration that runs on meme coins, Signal group chats, and Qatari jet planes is after. They don't want efficiency or a well-functioning government. They don't want a government that works. They want a government that works for them. Hey everyone, it's Ryan. Thanks so much for making it to the end. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend. It helps the video get to more people. See you next time.